Welcome. Appreciate the the resistance in this very hot temperature. My name is Francesca Mingrone, and I'm a staff attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law. We're very pleased to welcome you to this side event on fossil fuel-based economy and human rights. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. Please do not take pictures. Only those authorized to do that can take pictures. And also, this event is being live streamed online, so just be conscious of that. So the reason why we wanted to have this side event on fossil fuels is because really discussing the root cause of the triple planetary crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution is more timely than ever. As we are all feeling, temperatures are rising, and also production of fossil fuels is rising. But the science is very clear. Fossil fuels are driving climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And the only scientifically based approach to really solve the triple planetary crisis is to stop expansion of fossil fuel production and phase them out. At the UN level, states are now revising their nationally determined contributions under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. And this is really an important occasion to signal ambition to tackle effectively the climate crisis. But we also see that this framework is not providing adequate solutions to bring about effective change. We're also waiting for two important advisory opinions that will be released in the coming days and months. One by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights on the climate emergency and human rights is expected to be released tomorrow, so stay tuned. And it will be focusing on states' human rights obligations with regard to the climate crisis. And then the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on states' obligations with respect to climate change. And we also expected to clarify a lot about what states' obligations are in the context of the climate crisis, but hopefully also with regard to fossil fuels. Justice Cleveland, for instance, made a specific follow-up questions on fossil fuels, so we expect the court to look at this dimension. Here at the Human Rights Council, climate change remains high on the agenda. With the annual resolution on climate change and human rights, we also had an annual panel discussion on climate change in plenary just last Monday, the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on climate change also on Monday. But despite clear evidence, once again, of the role of fossil fuels in the climate crisis, and also repeated calls by a growing number of states, currently no environmental related resolution by the Human Rights Council has mentioned fossil fuels. So having all of this in mind, we decided to have this side event really to focus on what the legal framework is that guides states and their obligations. This side event complements the side event organized by the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change just earlier today at 12 p.m., which had a higher focus on international cooperation. We really have a stellar panel today. We have Her Excellency Doreen de Bruijn, Permanent Representative of the Republic of the Marshall Islands to the UN in Geneva. Welcome. We have Professor Elisa Morgera, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change, and Gillian Cooper, Political Director of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. And before I hand it over to the panel, we would like to screen some high-level remarks by His Excellency Ralph Regenbanu, Minister for Climate Change of the Republic of Vanuatu, that will kick off the conversation.
Ralph Regenbanu, Minister for Climate Change Adaptation, Energy, Environment, Meteorology, Geohazards, and Disaster Management of the Government of Vanuatu. I'm very pleased to join you online to deliver this short statement for the 59th session of the Human Rights Council. Just a few days ago, more than 60 of the world's leading climate scientists released the most up-to-date assessment of global warming. The findings are more than alarming. At current levels of carbon dioxide emissions, the world could reach the critical 1.5 degrees Celsius limit in as little as 3 years and reach 2 degrees Celsius within 2 decades. The root cause of the crisis is no mystery. It is fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the cause of the triple planetary crisis: climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss, as underlined by the 6 UN Special Rapporteurs in the 2023 joint statement. Fossil fuel activities, whether extraction, processing, transport, or combustion, undermine a wide spectrum of human rights: the right to health, housing, food, a clean and healthy environment, and ultimately the right to life. Civil and political rights are also present. seen in the growing repression of communities and individuals resisting fossil fuel projects. States have legal obligations under international human rights and environmental law to phase out fossil fuels. These obligations include preventing harm, regulating the private sector, and ensuring a just and equitable transition to sustainable alternatives. We are now entering a crucial phase of legal clarity. The advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, to be delivered on the 3rd of July, the upcoming proceedings before the International Court of Justice, and further clarify states' duties to act decisively on climate change. These legal processes matter. They enhance accountability and ensure that no state can continue to ignore the science or the law. The recent report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change is another urgent call to defossilize our economies now. Vanuatu stands firmly in support of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty as a global mechanism for cooperation to equitably phase out fossil fuels and deliver a just transition. The future we need to build must be built on clean, fair, and resilient foundations, where everyone can fully enjoy their right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So it's time to move beyond voluntary pledges. Climate action is now a legal duty under international law. We in the Pacific are already living the consequences of inaction. But the climate crisis knows no borders. What is already our reality will soon become yours. The time for action grounded in justice, is now. I thank you.
Many thanks to the government of Vanuatu for providing this video statement. We were very keen to hear from them, as they really have been at the front line of climate action at the international level, and also on the initiative to request an advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice. Now I'm turning to another leader from the Pacific Ocean, Ambassador Doreen de Broom. So the first question is to you. The Marshall Islands is once again a member of the Human Rights Council, so well done on getting another election. As one of the few SIDS to hold this position, the Marshall Islands have vowed to keep climate change high on the agenda. And for instance, the Marshall Islands is part of the core group that established the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change back in 2021. Can you tell us why it is important to you that the Human Rights Council considers climate change, even amidst the other human rights issues that face us? And also, we often hear that climate discussions are best left to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and are not for the Human Rights Council. So what is your view on that? Thank you.
Komodada, and thank you for the invitation, Francisco. Yahweh, everyone, and colleagues, excellencies, dear friends. A very good afternoon to everyone. On this very hot day, I come from a very hot country, and if I'm hot, something is wrong. Get one of these from Samoa. It really helps. Francesca, you and I have worked together for many years now. And as you know, I came to Geneva in 2019 to set up the Marshall Islands mission. And that was the first time that the Marshall Islands has had a presence in Geneva, and not just Geneva, the whole of Europe. And we remain the only presence in Europe. I was sent to open a mission here in part because the people of the Marshall Islands have very important priorities and deserve the voice on the Human Rights Council. We came to speak about the nuclear legacy, the rights of women and girls, and to elevate the voices of Pacific states. But it was immediately obvious to us that for a country like ours, all of our issues, all of our enjoyment of human rights, we're going to be tied up with issues of climate change. However hard we tried to think beyond that. Take women and girls, for example. In the Marshall Islands, there's a tradition of handing land down through a maternal lineage. This supports women's authority and status. But as land is lost due to climate-induced sea level rise, so is the status. So we can't talk about rights of women and girls without talking about climate change. Or if we take the right to freedom of movement, it's the same. Marshall Islands' priority is to ensure that Marshallese citizens can fulfill their right to remain in their home islands, and that it is their choice whether and when to migrate. But king tides, droughts, overwash mean outer atoll communities are now having to consider moving away from their traditional homes towards urban atolls. Outward migration is also at its highest level. This year's census showed the lowest ever population in our islands. 33%, that's 33%, lower than it was just 14 years ago. So that's why we're here, to embed climate change in all the considerations of the Council, because without taking action on climate change, there is no route to full enjoyment of human rights for countries like ours. Almost every challenge and issue that we face today is connected to climate change. From health to a clean environment, food security, water security, statehood, you name it. And we know we are not just speaking for ourselves. We heard the wonderful opening remarks from Minister Regan Banu, from our good friend and Pacific ally Vanuatu. We hope we can use our seat on the Council to help elevate the voices of Pacific SIDS. And you asked me, Francesca, why these issues should be considered here in the Human Rights Council and not left to the climate COP, the UNFCCC. We only have to look at the work of the Special Rapporteur to see how much important work there is to do here. It's a pleasure to share the panel with her. Her reports and that of her predecessors have moved towards the forward and thinking significantly on why human rights compels us to act on climate change. They have helped break down silos between these two worlds. We cannot address climate change without considering human rights. And we cannot realize full enjoyment of human rights without addressing climate change. So thank you. Thank you, Special Rapporteur. And thank you again, Francesca, for inviting us. Moltada.
Kumultata, Ambassador. I think the point that you make about breaking silos is very important. And I think it's worth remembering that it's also thanks to the work that the Human Rights Council did back in 2007, 2008, and onwards that the UNFCCC and then the Paris Agreement were able to incorporate human rights elements and considerations as we go forward. After hearing the lived experiences from our Pacific friends, now turning to Professor Elisa Morgera, of course, your mandate is entirely devoted to climate change, but you just released a groundbreaking report on the imperative of defossilizing our economies. You already started presenting the reports in plenary on Monday. You had your side event at 12 p.m. But really, we wanted to focus on the human rights dimension of fossil fuel phase out. So I have two questions to really kickstart the conversation. So first of all, is how is fossil fuel phase out an obligation under multiple sources of international law? And what does harmonization of such different sources, including human rights law duties, look like? And then looking specifically at human rights law, we know that these obligations clearly apply both domestically and extraterritorially, but the extraterritorial application of climate law is often challenged. And given the current jurisprudential landscape, we have a growing number, of course, of decisions by courts. We're waiting with a lot of interest, the ICJ and the Inter-American Court's advisory opinion. Can you share some reflections on states' extraterritorial obligations regarding fossil fuels phase out? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Francesca, for this really important question. And I think in a way, Minister Ralph said it very clearly. We are at a crucial phase of legal clarity, and my report on the fossilization come on the back of several significant legal clarifications on the multitude of existing international obligations in different international treaties across the environment, human rights, who are being affected in their objectives, in the realization of their obligations by climate change and the worsening impacts of climate change. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea said it, I think, the most clearly in the advisory opinion last year, how even if the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does not mention climate change, it is clearly to be interpreted so to understand the state's obligations to protect the marine environment from marine pollution, but just more generally protect the marine environment and marine life are a matter and entail effective mitigation of climate change, in fact, entail also protection of marine biodiversity and restoration of it as nature contributes to the regulation of our climate, and also imply obligations of financial cooperation. And so it is very clear that both from a legal perspective and a scientific perspective, that kind of harmonization of international obligations is almost, I think, completely worked out. And my report built on several clarifications that preceded it, including by all the UN treaty bodies, including by previous mandate holders of several special procedures, clarifying how climate change is undermining the protection of all our human rights in ways that are increasingly foreseeable, and how international human rights law obligations, both domestically and extraterritorially, clarify the responsibilities of states domestically and extraterritorially, individually, and as part of international cooperation, as well as business responsibility in this context. In a way, what I think is actually the most interesting, transformative aspect, once we read different bodies of international law that were developed at different times when we had different understandings of how our life supporting systems work on this planet. Yet in the light of the evidence we have today, both the kind of global level scientific assessments, but also the evidence, the lived experiences of those most affected by climate change, we see a very clear alignment of those obligations, looking at how the causes, the very well proven scientifically causes of climate change, and in particular fossil fuels, are leading to all the interlinked planetary crises we're facing, and how defossilizing our economies is the most sensible, the most effective measure to achieve multiple international obligations that are escaping, I think, all the goals that we have set. And that has to do with multiple areas of international environmental law. It has to do with the protection of human health. It has to do with the not undermining any of all the international human rights agreements that have been agreed upon and that have been binding on states for a very long time. In terms, I think also there's some important developments in the science that really help to understand and clarify the legal relevance of those obligations. And my report tried to bring together those understanding and maybe a broader range of scientific evidence that we usually consider in the context of the climate change regime. In particular, in terms of extraterritorial obligations, I've recalled the work that already treaty bodies did in this connection, clarifying how, and I'm thinking, for instance, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, when there is a causal link between the actions or omissions of states and the negative impacts on the human rights of children located outside their territories, there is a responsibility of states to prevent those impacts by exercising effective control over the activities that are the source of the harm, and in our case, the source of greenhouse gas emissions. I think maybe what I added to that interpretation is also bringing the lived experience and my own observations in the context of my country visit to Vanuatu last year, really witnessing how we're going well beyond significant harm in those countries who have been experienced for over 10 years, catastrophic climate events year in, year out, sometimes 3 times in the same year, really leading to serious and substantial compounded harm on human rights, to the point of undermining a human right to self-determination, confirming multiple grounds of discrimination, and in the particular case of children, really undermining all their hopes of a healthy and meaningful life. Just as my report was published, there was also a really interesting piece of science being published on the journal Nature around the evolution of attribution science, and looking at how we now have very solid methodologies to link specifically extreme climate events, such as extreme heat episodes, to the emissions of specific carbon measures in relation to specific episodes in specific countries. And apparently this framework can also apply to other, establish other causality links to other in specific climate events. Then my report, what it contributed to clarify is the specific content of those obligations, really looking at the need to legislate comprehensively, clearly and unequivocally about the phasing out of fossil fuels, providing timelines, providing unequivocal directions, both to the business sector and to the financial sector, and doing so then starting a process of co-developing the phase-out pathways in an inclusive participatory process that needs to be shaped by the lived experiences of the human rights holders most affected by climate change, and by the also insights and needs of the human rights holders that may be negatively impacted by the phase out, and that is of course the case of workers, but very much allowing for a clear, predictable, comprehensive process of clarifying how in different circumstances of different states, taking into account also common but differentiated responsibility, we all must need to progress towards defossilization and prohibiting some of the most harmful forms of fossil fuel extraction and production, and also taking very clear directions, much clearer than they are today, and priorities in the context of international cooperation, supporting this process and those participatory processes in all the other countries that are less responsible for climate change and have fewer means to advance on this path. And at the same time, the other side of the coin, and that is really crucial, looking at those 60 years of climate obstruction by the fossil fuel industry, how important it is to ensure carefully that any form of international cooperation, including based on finance or technology, does not inadvertently leads to more embedding, locking up or dumping of fossil fuels in other countries. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. I think what the reports that you presented does very well is to really merging science and human rights law, because to take adequate action and to fully understand what human rights-based action means, we also have to understand the science. And so it's also very helpful to have that more factual part to really inform then decisions and obligations. And the point you made about participation is very important, because of course we tend to focus a lot, as we should, on substantial rights and how climate change is affecting them, but the procedural dimension should not be overlooked. Effective policies can be put forward only in a really participatory manner, and so everything around the right to participation, access to information, access to justice. And it's actually interesting that as we talk in the room next door, we have the working group of the parties to the Aarhus Convention, which provides a clear and key framework for environmental democracy in Europe and Central Asia. A lot has been said on human rights-based action, what states' obligations are. So I'm turning back to Ambassador de Broom. We understand that we have to phase out fossil fuels. So, and you, of course, as the Marshall Islands have been one of the biggest proponents. So what is your assessment of progress on a more political level, and what more would be needed at the Human Rights Council specifically, since we have before us a draft resolution? Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Francesca. And I apologize in advance if I'm going to sound like a broken record. I think that the Special Rapporteur's report gives an excellent assessment of progress, or unfortunately, lack of progress. As I said on Monday in the interactive dialogue, making commitments can be easy, but following through with them can be more difficult. So even after we agreed in the UNFCCC to transition away from fossil fuel, some countries continue to extract and use more than ever before. Even though existing fossil fuel infrastructure alone would deliver more emissions than the 1.5 degree pathway can tolerate, countries continue to build new infrastructure, new wells, mines, power plants, export facilities. And my country remains committed to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We were proud to be part of designing this first of a kind framework, which created a lifeline for countries like ours. But we are undeniably frustrated with the speed of progress, and we're not doing enough. Once again, we urge all parties to follow through on their commitments to submit updated NDCs aligned to the human rights principles, and to begin urgently to transition away from fossil fuel. We're pleased to join other climate leaders in the Pacific as well as Colombia, considering options to go further and faster through the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. We are also proud to be part of the coalition on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. As the Special Rapporteur's report makes clear, the world is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry by 400 billion per year. Even while we struggle to mobilize basic climate finance, removing fossil fuel subsidies alone could cut emissions by 10%. And furthermore, we are participating actively in the global climate leadership efforts via international legal proceedings. Thanks to deliberations in courts like the ICJ, the IDLOS, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, we are building a much clearer picture of states' obligations. We hope that states will take the discussion they've heard in these courts back home and feel even more empowered to rapidly transition away from fossil fuel. These discussions should also inspire the private sector, and it is my sincere hope that collectively we can inspire companies and corporations to rethink their investments. I just want to finish by thanking you again. And Madam Special Rapporteur, your report has all the answers we need. Let's work together to exemplify your call to act and answer it ahead of the next COP in Bella. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. You made the important point also of corporations' duties, and we should not forget of the ongoing process to negotiate a potentially binding treaty to regulate transnational corporations and other business enterprises. And we're really working also to make sure that the environmental and climate dimension is effectively included in that instrument. Back to you, Professor Mordera. We already mentioned the advisory opinions, including by the ITLOS, which of course didn't look at human rights, but focus on the law of the sea and provided important clarification also on how GHG emission qualify as pollution of the marine environment. We also heard from Minister Bergenbanu of the joint statement by special procedures. You did mention the progressive work that has been made by different mechanisms, and you did mention treaty bodies. When we talk about implementation and what it means to comply with human rights obligations in the context of climate change, treaty bodies really provide an important added value, because especially in their state review process, they can look in detail at what the state is doing with regards, of course, to the rights protector under the relevant conventions and covenants, but they can also provide specific guidance on what it means to respect human rights while stepping up climate action. And you prepared an annex to your reports with some guiding questions that can be considered by treaty bodies when reviewing states. states. It's worth mentioning the various general comments already touch upon or look specifically at the question of environmental degradation. The CRC, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, of course, issued a landmark general comment on obligations with regard to the environment and climate change, but also the CEDAW's done pivotal work with regard especially to disaster risk reduction and phase out of fossil fuels. And we shall not forget the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So maybe offering now the opportunity to you to unpack a bit what your assessment is of the work that has been so far, and what more, what bigger role can treaty bodies play in this context?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And again, this is something on which I've been thinking from the outset of the mandate, thinking about the role of the ecosystem of the UN human rights bodies and experts specialized in human rights. Of course, many other rapporteurs, as I compiled in my very first reports, have contributed significantly to understand disproportionate impacts of climate change on human rights holders. And the treaty bodies themselves have contributed to clarify state obligations from their specific perspective. In fact, I even had the opportunity to collaborate quite closely with the Committee on the Rights of the Child in the preparation of the General Comment on Children's Rights and a Healthy Environment right before my mandate. And I've continued to remain in conversation with them, as well as with CEDAW in particular, and the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, including joint reflection sessions where I was both learning from them what are the challenges of finding the most helpful questions to understand how states are making progress or whether they're not making progress on their climate commitments in ways that effectively protect human rights. So I think it is an ongoing learning for human rights experts. And I've been actually approached and specifically asked by treaty body colleagues to, in preparing my reports, to help already provide considerations for them to be able to follow up on specific findings of my work. So I was very grateful of the opportunity to develop one of the annexes, which I encourage all of you to look at, on considerations for treaty bodies, where there's both a contextualization of how each treaty body has already addressed specific aspects of that relate to the recommendations I make on defossilization. And then equally from then, how do we build from that, and how different treaty bodies can review states' conduct, taking a more systematic approach to all the areas of progress, be that development of national law, be that the financing, be the effective control of business actors or financial actors, being that attention to the impacts, differentiated impacts on human rights domestically and abroad, and really guiding, I think, what will be a constructive process of monitoring states' conduct and providing specific guidance, focalizing on areas where we need progress, even in countries where maybe we have seen progress on phase out, but maybe not on all fossil fuels, or with progress in some areas, but not others. And I think more broadly, there's an opportunity, and I'm really keen to have conversations with colleagues about how the whole of the UN system can make individual specific contributions based on their mandates to the implementation of the recommendations. I'm happy to mention that also the UN University is going to support a process of developing an implementation plan by different UN agencies. And in my own report as well, I focused on some responsibilities of UN agencies based on the Charter of the UN, around how they can also support and play specific roles on some of the more complex areas related to our path towards defossilization.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting to hear that there is this ongoing dialogue with treaty bodies. And definitely when we talk about breaking silos, we also mean to break silos within the human rights community. So that's a very good practice. So I would really encourage everybody to read the annex. which, if I might do some self-advertisement, complements well a publication that CL prepares annually that looks more broadly at climate change and the way treaty bodies look at it over the years. And so this is hopefully going to provide very good guidance to treaty body members on how to increase their work. And as you were saying, really looking at different dimensions, not just the impacts, but once again, what it means to protect and promote political rights and civil rights and so on. And now turning to Ms. Cooper of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. We already heard from Minister Regenbanu and Ambassador De Broom mentioning this initiative. The underlying starting point is that the current frameworks are not delivering effective change. And also, as the Special Rapporteur has just explained, fossil fuel phase out is required under multiple sources of the existing international law. So since you are promoting the case for an ad hoc new instrument, can you tell us why we need such an instrument like the FFMPT, as we say with an acronym, for our effective just transition away from fossil fuels? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for the question and for the opportunity to be here. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Professor Mojera for your really historic and groundbreaking report. It was great excellent to have that. And really the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative was born out of the issues that we're discussing here, this enormous gap between the climate commitments that are made by states, the steer from science, and the fact that there's continued extraction and expansion. This has been, sobering the impacts of that explained in your report. And just to kind of reiterate some of the stats that were also shared in the report, that production is projected to be around 110% higher than the 2030 needs to keep production consistent with limiting warming to 1.5. That's double. And actually, industry is leading to overcapacity of fossil fuels. And actually, new data that was recently published by Oil Change International shows that despite the commitments to transition at COP28, global North producer countries are responsible for nearly 70% of projected carbon dioxide pollution from new oil and gas fields and fracking wells between 2025 and 2035. So really what we're seeing is that while the Paris Agreement creates this holistic framework for climate action, its focus really has been on emissions reduction. Fossil fuels isn't mentioned at all in the Paris Agreement. And although, as you've mentioned already, there have been some small gains to include commitments, countries may choose to include fossil fuel supply measures in their NDCs, but it's not a requirement. We feel that a treaty specifically targeted at the fossil fuel industry is important because of the complexity of this issue, the multifaceted issues that you've clearly explained in the report, needs to reframe the defossilization of the economy, not just on climate, but also all of the other egregious issues related to humanitarian impacts, economic, developmental impacts, and the health impacts as well. And I also want to add that one of the key things that I think we also need to raise here is that when we talk about state obligations to transition from fossil fuels, we cannot not talk about the inequity of the global financial architecture and the debt crisis and the current climate financing arrangements, which come from the same logic. We can't leave this issue aside because the fiscal constraints of countries, particularly in the global south, this is one of the biggest barriers to implementing, the energy transition, let alone the costs of loss and damage. UNCTAD has valued the global public debt crisis at the end of 2023 at $97 trillion US. And according to the IMF, more than half of low-income developing countries are in high or at high risk of debt distress. There's actually net movement of finance from the global south to the global north. due to debt servicing, trade deficits, trillions of dollars. And actually, if you take an example from the region where I am from, this time last year, the island of Grenada was hit by Hurricane Beryl, which was the earliest storm of that magnitude in the hurricane season. And it cost over $200 million of loss and damage. And there's need to borrow to be able to rebuild, but Grenada still has to continue to pay on its existing debt payments. So it did eventually have a debt pause clause, but that only pauses it. It means they still have to continue paying it. So, these kinds of arrangements are not helping. 85%, for example, of renewable energy investment has gone to the global north. And of the percentage that remains, 83% of that is in renewable energy investments and is provided in loans. And then if you look at the loss and damage fund, that only has $700 million in it, and then match that with the profits of fossil fuel companies. So, and added to that, there are many countries in the global south who are entirely fiscally dependent on fossil fuels for their economy. And the current disorderly transition will really hit those nations severely. There's a significant number of them that are facing substantial risk from falling oil and gas demand and stranded assets, and there's no plan at the moment for those countries to be able to transition. So the issue, you've raised quite well in your paper on common but differentiated responsibilities is really central to the treaty initiative's concept. We need to take into account the differing capacities and economies of different countries in the plan for the transition, and also the historical responsibilities. So a treaty dedicated to fossil fuels can set time-bound timelines, as you've raised, for countries to defossilize their economy. States with more fiscal capacity should be transitioning first and fastest, and those that have less fiscal capacity would have a much longer window to transition. In our policy and our research work, we're looking at different financing and instruments that could be within a treaty that would look at different instruments and mechanisms that would raise funds from high-emitting corporate entities, from developed countries, disperse funds, perhaps some sort of just transition fund, loans, a more coordinated approach to bilateral arrangements, such as like the JETPs, remove barriers for countries that risk, that face high risk from accessing finance, the debt restructuring, helping countries to diversify their economies, so taxes and levies that would channel finance to alternative industries, trade measures to facilitate greater diversification, potential also for mutually beneficial trade relationships, some sort of producers-sellers club for member states that are producers and those that are consumers, so that they can, trade down their remaining fossil fuel revenues and plan for that. And transparency measures as well, what really is classified as climate finance, and around debt measures and transparency as well for the private sector, something that was also raised. So, at the moment, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is led by 17 Global South nations. And this group of nations is growing. And given the kind of structural traps and the inequity in our global economic system, and the fact that, countries in the global north have actually far exceeded their global carbon budget. And of course, global south paying far more. A process that really repositions these states at the center of the international process to shape the needs of a just transition, feels only fair and just and frankly necessary. There is an abundance of renewable energy that can be harnessed with greater international cooperation, which can be catalyzed by a new treaty, and to get off as the carbon tunnel vision, as you referred to it, and to defossilize.
Thank you very much also for raising the question of finance, loss and damage, because of course we're focusing now on the need to stop at the source the issue, but we shall not forget the need for effective financial support and also to remedy those harms that cannot be recovered from. And it's very interesting that the climate resolution that is being negotiated this year looks at climate finance, and the Secretary General also produced a very important report on loss and damage and human rights law. And of course also Professor Zumorgera's report also make the case that there are obligations to remedy human rights harm in the context of climate change and fossil fuel production. And it's very interesting also to see this, how you're thinking about creating new mechanisms to really incentivize states to phase out, thinking of co-benefits in joining the initiative. So thank you for explaining that more in detail. I am conscious of time and I want to devote some time for Q&A or comments from the floor. So I will open now to the floor to see if there are some reactions, questions for our panelists. Otherwise, I might just follow up with a question for Elisa myself. The floor is open. Yes, please, can you introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Daniel Olive from the South Center and Developmental Organization for Developing Countries. It's interesting the element that you mentioned about the issue of financing for climate change and climate action. And you mentioned one of the structural reforms that we require, which is there. But there is also one of the three key issues that developing countries face in particular, which is ISDS, investor state settlement mechanisms, which have the increasing and tackling, I would say, problems of increasing debt, but also limiting the policy space of the states to take action with regards to the protection of human rights, with regards to the protection of, with regards to climate action. So in that particular sense, I think that it's necessary to consider how the discussion on climate action, in particular, for example, the moving away from fossil fuels, should consider also certain kind of elements for limiting the possibility of starting ISDS claims. And this is an issue that is not only affecting, although the burden falls more on developing countries, something that is not only affecting developing countries. In 2024, according to UNCTAD, for example, there is a major number of cases was against developing countries, but at the same time, one of the major cases was against one particular developed country, which is Australia, with respect to a decision taken to phasing out coal plants and coal mines. So with that respect, one of the questions I would have, there is still time for answering, is how do you see what is the role that the Human Rights Council would have to increase the coordination among the different United Nations organizations and agencies with respect to the effects that climate change has, and particularly ISDS has, with respect to climate action, and particularly phasing out fossil fuels.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I see Andrea. Please, can you also introduce yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. Andrea Carmen, Yaqui Nation, International Indian Food Council. I have a question about the whole discussion on human rights, because I discussed a few times on panels we were on this week how amazingly refreshing it is to hear human rights be centered around discussions on climate change, whether it's transition minerals or phasing out fossil fuels, etc. Because we don't have that, I guess, welcoming on this topic of the UNFCCC. I'm just coming from the team in Bonn. But I notice when states talk about human rights, every state in the Human Rights Council is saying, yes, we're for human rights. But some, and we know which ones, are saying, well, really the right that matters is the right to develop. The right is self-determination. States, which means the same thing we're trying to push against at the UNFCCC is each state determining their own priorities for transition minerals, just transition, fossil fuel development, phase down, phase out, etc. So how do you deal with that as United Nations officials, that everyone here is for human rights, but they're really prioritizing different ones and even defining what that looks like differently vis-a-vis this topic. It's a strategic question because we're going into COP30 here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are no other questions, and I'm also conscious of time, then I will turn to you, Professor Morgera, since both questions were for you, but I also invite other panelists if you want to also provide some comments before we wrap up. So back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And in a way, I think Andrea's comments are at the beginning of an answer to Daniel's questions. Clearly, being here at the Human Rights Council means that this is the home where we can sometimes reframe completely issues that are maybe discussed in human rights devoid ways from the lens of human rights. And that provides both legal clarity about existing applicable international obligations, but also in terms of, I don't think even just a strategic, but like more legal clarity around the fact that we can't pick and choose which human rights we protect. We need to understand the indivisibility of all human rights and the fact that we need to protect everyone's human rights. And I think that that is where I think that legal clarity brings then a whole more holistic and deeper perspective around, state obligations, and also I think clarifies limitations to states' discretion in implementing their international obligations. I mean, being an international environmental lawyer by training, I'm very familiar about how states in agreeing on their international environmental obligations, and that is the case for climate change as well, tend to carve a very broad margin of discretion in implementing the agreement. And unfortunately, that has often led to what we're currently seeing, limited action and ineffective action that has led us to planetary crisis, even if we had the knowledge and the understanding of what needed to happen many decades ago when I started my career. And what's really crucial is then understanding how the indivisibility of all human rights means that then when we interpret specific human rights, such as the human right to development or the human right to self-determination, we need to understand state action and the limitation to state discretion in terms of preventing foreseeable negative impacts on other human rights. And this is where the human right to development can't be used and interpreted in ways that are foreseeably going to lead to human rights violations, which is the case of climate change and specifically of fossil fuel production as use, as all the evidence addressed in my report. And maybe, sorry, yeah, very quickly, then the role of the Human Rights Council is also maybe to point us to other fora or start maybe new conversations on issue in international law that we don't see properly addressed from a human rights perspective. And I think the question of a fundamental reform of international investment law is one. There is the question of dispute settlement, but there's also the question of the objectives, of the safeguards that disproportionately protect private interest of foreign investors against the interest and the regulatory power of states to protect their human rights holders and the environment. And maybe we need a direction from the Human Rights Council, either a mandate for the Office of the High Commissioner to start develop options, an indication to which human rights bodies should make themselves available to host such a process under very specific premises that are based on the indivisibility of human rights and how that guides our understanding of state obligations.
Thank you so much. I would then give 1 minute to Ms. Cooper and then closing remarks to the ambassador. Thank you.
I think on the last, I just wanted to address that question of ISDS, that it is certainly something that has been considered in the work that the Treaty Initiative is putting together, and how can the legal aspects of the treaty protect nations that are members of this. This kind of work at the moment ongoing, but it's a clear issue that we have also sought to address as well.
Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Francesca. Just some closing remarks and comments that will, just a reminder. While my country is and others like it will be probably the first to go, no country is immune. Think about our most treasured ecosystems. Those are also the fighting line. The fight against climate change is a collective one. And we must all declare our sincere and heartfelt commitments to take action. Every one of us, government and individual. We must win this war. And this is a war for nothing less than the future of humanity. Come on, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I don't think further words are needed. As we negotiate here at the Human Rights Council or other UN bodies, we shall really remember that it's not just words, but they do have an impact on the ground. So thank you for this important reminder. We have unfortunately reached the end of this event. Heartfelt thank you for all of you to come today. Huge thanks to the panelists, Ambassador De Bruin, Professor Morgera, Ms. Cooper, and to the government of Vanuatu. Please help yourself with some coffee and biscuits at the outside, and we hope to continue the conversation together to really make sure that the Human Rights Council can be up to our hopes and effectively contribute to effective climate action. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. I realize I'm from Granada. I'm actually from Trinidad and Antigua.